The good news is Armored Core 6 has a really great HDR implementation, and yeah, that's it. Armored Core 6 has a really great HDR implementation.
We're close to Rubicon. Wake the dog up.
Handler Walter verified. Activating cerebral coral control device. Augmented human C4621 has awakened.
Time to get to work, 621. I'm powering down your entry capsule. On my signal. Now, activate the AC.
Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. Let's start with the very important things first. Does Armored Core 6 on the PlayStation 5 and most likely on the Xbox Series as well, because I'm just testing the PlayStation 5 today. I don't have access to the Xbox Series, but in terms of HDR, both versions should be very close to each other, or there shouldn't be any difference. But the question is, does this game support the HDR system level calibration? And the short answer is no, because we have HDR settings in the game. Okay, so let's start with the HDR in-game settings, what we have in Armored Core 6. And the first thing what I found is that if we are not in the game, in the actual game, you can't adjust the HDR settings. But as soon you are in the game, you can adjust the HDR settings. And what you can find in the HDR settings is the adjust brightness setting, which is changing the overall brightness of the game. Then we have the maximum brightness setting, which is the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. And last but not least, we have the adjust saturation, which is changing the saturation. For a proper HDR implementation, we need a couple of things. We need specular highlights, we need bright specular highlights, but even more important is we need a proper HDR black level floor, which means no HDR black level rays, but that's in most of the games a problem nowadays, but thanks God not in Armored Core 6, at least not on a PlayStation 5, and I'm very sure the same counts for the Xbox Series X, and I can't wait to test actually the PC version. But here right now, PlayStation 5 version, no problem with HDR black level rays at all. The game looks very great. We have great specular highlights, and the contrast thanks to no HDR black level rays is on a very high level. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the settings in the game, and let's talk about the maximum peak brightness and stuff like that. And this example here again is a very good example on how great the HDR black level floor is actually. We have literally no problem at all. And what you can see here also is that we have a lot of specular highlights actually. So everything what is not gray, everything which has bluish, green or maybe purple colors is HDR, or at least brighter than SDR. And we have in the very beginning here of the game, and I apologize because I don't want to spoil too much. I don't want to actually show you too much from the game before you actually haven't played it. But we have a lot of actually very great specular highlights. I mean, look at this effect right now. This means the brightness is changing all the time, which means it has a great effect. It's very hard to show on camera, of course, but when you play the game and when you use a proper TV or screen, you know exactly what I'm talking about. HDR implementation in this game is really great in my opinion. But now let's take a closer look on the settings. Okay, so let's start with the adjust brightness setting, and you can see this setting is responsible for the overall brightness in the game. So it will bring more specular highlights actually when you increase this. But the problem is, and I found this in some scenarios, if you increase this too much, and standard setting is actually 5, but if you increase this too much, you will also lift the HDR black level floor slightly. So I haven't found an issue in case of that you have HDR black level raise, but you should be very careful what you do, because you don't want to lose the great contrast. So even right now at this very moment in this level with brightness set to 10, we have still perfect HDR black level floor. But again, this may change in different levels. So my recommendation for the adjust brightness setting is quite simple. Do not decrease this setting on the PlayStation 5, and most likely the same counts for the Xbox Series X. And the reason is very simple, because you will also lose maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. So all what you can do is either you leave it at the standard setting 5 or you increase it slightly. But again, keep in mind that if you increase this too much, you may have bad HDR black level floor, which leads to HDR black level raise, and then the contrast in the game is not as good as before. The next setting what we have is the maximum brightness setting, and this is the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. And the standard setting is 1000, and this is not a bad start for a TV like the LG G2 or the S95B with a maximum peak brightness of around 1000 nits. But what I found is that 1000 nits setting in the game is not quite the best setting what I found. As you can see here right now, the maximum CLL is around 860 nits, but we like to have it a little bit better. That's why I would actually recommend to increase this setting slightly, because then we're getting around 940, 950 candela or nits, depending on the situation of course, and I found this fits my TV a little bit better. So let's talk about the adjust saturation slider, and the standard setting is 5, and if you increase this, you can actually see that you get a lot of more colors actually, like BT 2020 colors actually. If you like this on the other hand, that's a complete different story. I personally have to say that I found the standard setting 5 a little bit too less, so I increased actually the slider to around 7 to have a little bit of a more powerful picture. But again, this is absolutely up to you, because even you increase this to 10, you will not change anything in terms of the maximum peak brightness or the HDR black level floor. Okay, so what are my recommended settings now for Armored Core 6 on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series? In terms of brightness, I told you already, I would not decrease this below 5, because then you will lose maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. You can increase this value as you like it, but I found that at some point you will have a washed out picture. So be careful. If you like to have a little bit of a brighter picture, then maybe try dynamic tone mapping on. In terms of the maximum peak brightness, it's quite simple. Always select a value slightly above the maximum peak brightness of your screen. In terms of the LGCX, with a maximum peak brightness of around 800 nits, use 900. For the LG G2 or screens with 1000 nits maximum peak brightness, use 1100. And for LG G3, S95C or similar screens with around 1400 nits peak brightness, use 1500. In terms of colors, Armored Core 6 is just average. Most of the time you have Rec 7 or 9 colors. I found increasing saturation to 7 gives you a better impression and a more powerful picture. But this is my personal preference. Use saturation as you like it. And now let's talk about HGiG versus dynamic tone mapping on. And I would not recommend to use dynamic tone mapping off, because you will lose a lot of details in specular highlights. So my recommendation is actually HGiG, because also what I found, dynamic tone mapping on will clip a lot of details in specular highlights. HGiG, in my opinion, with the standard setting 5 and adjusted maximum peak brightness settings, is my recommendation. Okay, my friends, that's it for this very I don't even know if this was a short video or a long video, but that's it for this video. And what I'm going to prepare in the meantime, or maybe when you watch this video, I'm working on a performance review, PlayStation 5 and PC. So I'm not quite sure when I can play the PC version, because so far, when I was able to play the PlayStation 5 version, the PC version was actually not released so far. So it looks like PC version is coming a couple of hours later. I don't know why that's the case, but that's how it is. Anyway, in terms of so far, in terms of the performance, I'm actually quite happy. There is not much to complain about, but I will go into more details, of course, in my next video. In terms of HDR, I really don't have anything to complain. I mean, maybe we should have a little bit more colors in terms of, or more BT 2020 or DCI-P3 colors, because most of the colors, as in many other games, are just in the SDR, in Rec 709. That's the thing. But we have this in so many games, and to be very honest, if you increase the saturation slider slightly to maybe 6 or 7, it actually makes a big difference. So I like the game, I like the presentation, I like how HDR is implemented in the game, because no HDR black level rays means we have actually really great contrast. And this is so important nowadays, because we have seen so many bad games in terms of HDR. This one is a very nice surprise. Thank you very much for watching me. I see you guys next time. Bye.